great to see everybody on this Friday, first Friday in June. And we are just, in case you're looking at the agenda, wondering where's our small group introductions and our breakouts, we're going to hold off on that this month because we wanted to make more time for our guest speakers. So we will do that again in our meeting in July. So for today, we are switching to our second policy priority. This is the priority to prioritize justice and equity in all aspects of climate resilient investments. So this policy priority calls on policymakers to address all aspects of justice and equity, including historical injustice, communities' needs for direct financial support, and the need for decision-making processes that give agency to those most impacted. I'm sorry, I have to be looking at my notes. I don't have that all memorized. More information on this policy priority, however, is available in the 2022 ASAP priority policy priorities summary. And I don't know if that's something we can drop a link in the chat just to refresh people's memories of the details within this policy priority as well as our others. We have two guest speakers today whom I'm really excited to introduce, who will be helping us learn more about this topic and help prompt discussion for our July meetings. So we first have Annie Bennett, who's the Associate Director for the Adaptation Program at the Georgetown Climate Center. Annie is, excuse me, sorry. Oh no, sorry, my notes just went away. Here we go. Annie provides legal and policy support for state, regional, and local adaptation efforts. Annie works most directly on policy issues relating to resilience in the transportation sector, cross-jurisdictional adaptation and governance, and equitable natural solutions to build resilience in communities. We also have Mohanka, who leads the Transformational Climate Finance Initiative at the Chisholm Legacy Project. Coming from a background in energy policy and cooperative economics, Vic is designing a new program to incubate new projects all over the US with the goals of supporting Black frontline leadership and a just transition. After presentations, we'll have time for Q&A and discussion. But first, is John on the call?
I haven't seen John yet.
Okay. Well, we want to have a quick update on the action plan related to these policy priorities and the discussions that we've been having. So, Brianna, do you want to provide that update? Or do you want to wait for
John will have the best update. So why don't we go to round robin updates with Anna, and if John comes on, he can tell us the latest.
Great.
Anna?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Hope everyone's having a good day so far. Really excited for these presentations, but before we jump into those, we're just going to do our normal policy updates. If anybody has updates on legislation you've been tracking that you want to put in the chat, please feel free, or if you want a moment now to share anything, you could raise your hand and we can make sure you get a chance. Otherwise, I thought it would be useful to take this time to give a little bit of an update on the National Climate Adaptation and Resilience Strategy Act. We've talked about it a couple of times in this group, but it's been a little while. So I'm going to share a little bit of an update on that and what ASAP's doing to do some direct advocacy on it in case anyone is interested in getting more involved with that. So I'll do that in just a minute. And I will add basically all the other updates into the Slack channel so that everyone can find those there. So for the National Climate Adaptation Resilience Strategy Act, which I'm just going to call NCARS from now on, just to simplify the name, is a bill that was introduced back in January on a bipartisan basis and a bicameral basis, so in the House and in the Senate at the federal level. And it's a piece of legislation that would create a chief resilience officer in the White House and would do a lot in the way of creating more coordination across agencies and with non-federal partners to help inform the development and updating, once developed, of a national adaptation strategy that would help to guide funding, which is relevant to what we're talking about today, but also kind of adaptation work more broadly. So ASAP has put out a support blog post about this and other kind of complementary work, and is working with a number of other groups to kind of encourage the Senate and the House to take this bill up and move it through Congress and pass it. And so what ASAP is up to is the strategy right now is to encourage more Republican co-sponsors. And so staff for leaders on this bill in the Senate and the House have helped identify some Republicans that might be most interested. And ASAP's role is to try to coordinate members who are from the states where those representatives are from and those senators are from, to kind of coordinate and both write op-eds and also have meetings with their representatives to express their support for the bill and why it would be specifically helpful for adaptation practitioners like everyone on this call. So the 4 states we're really focused on are Ohio, Michigan, Florida, and Utah. So if anyone's from those states or has colleagues that are from those states or interest specifically in those states and wants to help us on this effort, feel free to shoot me a message and I can drop my email in the chat. And I think it's also in the agenda, but we are in the process of setting up those Hill meetings. They're going to be happening towards the end of this month. So if you're at all interested in getting involved, now's the time. And one kind of point to add on kind of where this bill is at. It's currently still hasn't been taken up by the committees that it's been referred to, but there are more co-sponsors that have been signing on. So that's good to see. And the goal of Senator Coons's office, and Coons is the main sponsor of this bill on the Senate side, is that this piece of legislation would ultimately get attached to the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a piece of legislation that is kind of one of those must-pass ones that happens every year. So with that being the goal, we are really focused on the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee in the Senate, which is where this bill has been referred to, but then also the Armed Services Committee in the Senate, which is where it would need to go if it was going to get attached to the NDAA. So that's kind of what's going on right now. If you're intrigued, want to learn more, want to be a part of it, especially if you're from those states, but even if you're not, feel free to reach out and happy to loop you into the work we're doing.
Can you say the states one more time, Anna?
Yes, it's Michigan, Ohio, Florida, and Utah. I can drop those in the chat as well. So that's kind of what's going on with NCARS and with ASAP's advocacy. I think I saw Rachel on here. Rachel, if there's anything I missed, feel free to jump in. But that is the update I have. And so I'll pass it back to you, Laura.
Rachel, did you want to add anything?
Nope, I was going to just say, sounds great. Thanks, Anna.
Great. Okay. And we do have John. So that's it on policy updates?
Yes, except I see Josh raising his hand. So maybe Josh will leave something quickly.
Yeah, just to quickly throw out there, I posted on Slack and some other places, but for those of you who haven't heard, Crystal Lehman has just been appointed special advisor to the White House Domestic Climate Office for climate adaptation and resilience. So that's under Gina McCarthy and also with David Hayes, who we've heard from. So I think she's the first high-level policy advisor on our topic who's been appointed outside of the sort of National Security Council framework. So I think that's a very positive development. If anybody knows her, has contact with her previously, she was at CEQ. Before that, she was at FEMA. That would be probably helpful to us. We might want to get her to try to be a speaker on this group at some point if we can. So
awesome. Thanks, Josh.
I actually didn't know Crystal. I interacted with her just 2 weeks ago. So if anyone needs to get in touch with her, happy to facilitate.
Oh, awesome.
Right.
Thanks, Vidya. We'll probably be tapping you for that.
Great. And John is on the call. So let's circle back to John for an update on the action plan.
Hi, everyone. Sorry I was late. Just was distracted this morning. Anyway, so one of our goals for the policy practice group, as we went through each of these policy priorities and had speakers and then did the follow-up kind of breakout sessions and took some notes, was to develop an action plan. What can the policy practice group do to further the policy and be maybe a little bit more proactive on policy, or other mechanisms for getting the goal of better climate adaptation out there. So I wrote the first action plan based on the notes from the breakout sessions we had in May, and they were great notes. There was a lot of good information in there. I tried to distill down into what were some of the actions we could take at both at the federal, state, and local level. So that action plan is written. It's about a page and a half, mostly bullet points. I would say that I wrote it based on key themes I saw in the notes, but those who were in those different sessions might have different takes on what was needed. And I might have missed something too. I'll totally admit that. I will not take it personally if someone looks at it, reviews it, and just rips it apart. So I think it was this kind of get something out there and have people respond to it. But I think this needs to be something that we as a group, the PPG group, take on as what we want to see. So this was on better availability of data. So I think the struggle there is, where do you want the data to be at the state, federal, or local level? But anyway, so I took a chance. I took a stab at it, and I'll put the link in the chat. And our goal is to have about 2 weeks review. So we did the breakout groups in May, and then as the lead for that policy priority, I wrote the action plan, and then I'll put it out to the group. You're not obligated to review it, but if you're interested, please review it. If you thought it was a good discussion, please review it. If you were a note taker, please review it. If you just want to review it, please review it. But we have about 2 weeks. It's about a page and a half, so it's not a huge read. What I would love is in use feature. Yes, of course, that's in there too. I did repeat the policy priority at the top of the action plan, so we know what it was. But anyway, it's there. I think I have some advice for Laura, as she writes, as we do the breakout groups next month on this topic. So, and this one's even a bigger struggle with the ESJ topic. But everybody, I mean, it looks like there were some really great discussions in every group, and I wish I could have bounced around to each group and listened to what people were saying. But this was my interpretation of the notes. So have at it, and I will check on it probably in a week or so before we have our next kind of leadership team meeting to see where we stand and who's commented. But like I said, feel free. And this was the first one, so the idea here is to maybe create a better template for Laura with everybody else's input. And if there's any questions, it's open to questions. The link's in the chat. And that's all I have, Laura. Thanks for facilitating today.
So 2 weeks from now is, should we say June 17th, John?
Sure. Is it June? Yes, that's June 17th. I will check the comments, and that would be what? That's about a week or so before our next leadership meeting. Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. Yeah,
we planned it like that for a reason.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for doing that, John. And I have my instructions now. So, all right. Well, this is great. We're running a little ahead of schedule, which is wonderful because that'll leave us a few more minutes for discussions. So we'd like to switch over to our invited guest now. Annie Bennett is going to start us off. So Annie, if you want to go ahead and share your slides. And
all right, thanks, Laura. Let me see if I can get this going. Start slideshow. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the invite. I'm really glad to be here today and see and meet all of you. So I'm going to be talking about a resource that we developed at the Georgetown Climate Center, our Equitable Adaptation Legal and Policy Toolkit, and how it can be used by policymakers and others to advance equitable adaptation investments. Before I jump in, I just wanted to give a little introduction for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Georgetown Climate Center. We're a nonpartisan institute based at Georgetown Law, focused on policy solutions to mitigate and adapt to climate change. The center was founded in 2009 with a primary mission to be a resource for the states on climate, energy, and transportation policy and to help inform the federal dialogue on these issues based on lessons from the states. In support of this mission, there are several primary ways that we work. So first, we work directly with state and local governments on climate policy development. We also host a wide range of convenings, workshops, and peer learning opportunities. We work with students primarily across Georgetown University's undergraduate and graduate programs, especially at the Law Center, to provide in-depth analysis in support of state and local efforts to advance climate policy. And then finally, we develop online tools and resources to make best practices more accessible to our primary audience. So in that last category of tools and resources, we've developed several toolkits that are intended to support decision makers on discrete adaptation and resilience topics. Our Equitable Adaptation Legal and Policy Toolkit is one of our two most recent toolkits and was released in 2020. It includes legal and policy tools and best practices, practical considerations and trade-offs, and case study examples on how to integrate equity into adaptation and resilience processes and substantive outcomes. Developing the toolkit was a huge team effort. So it was led by Tiffany Ganthier, who was formerly an Institute Associate for the Georgetown Climate Center, but has since moved on. And we had a team of authors who worked on the different chapters. We also consulted with a group of advisors from community-based organizations and NGOs and other experts that work directly with frontline communities to improve access to resources and build resilience. This toolkit was built in recognition that implementing equitable adaptation requires a sustained effort to dismantle barriers facing frontline communities, including institutionalized racism in government policies, decades of underinvestment, lack of educational and economic opportunity, and threats from displacement and gentrification, especially in more recent years. So to get at these goals, the toolkit includes legal and policy tools designed to build equity in procedure and substantive outcomes. You can see this screenshot here. Sorry, it's a little bit small, but this shows kind of the basic organization for the toolkit, looking at the table of contents on the right side, with the procedural equity chapters up front, and then sort of more solutions-oriented tools for equitable adaptation that follow. And each of these chapters has a subset of more specific policy tools. For each of those sections, we assess different economic, environmental, social inequity, administrative, and legal considerations and trade-offs for implementing that particular tool. Another feature that brings these tools to life is the numerous case studies that illustrate how cities across the US are implementing these equitable adaptation solutions and procedures. So I'll give a little bit more of an overview of the chapters and a few case study examples. The chapters relating to procedural equity include a community-driven engagement processes, governance and budgeting, and data metrics and monitoring. These are designed to help ensure that communities have a voice in decision-making processes and that these processes are resulting in investments that communities are calling for. So the community engagement tools include, for example, legal mandates for public participation and strategies to pay for the costs of effective community engagement. The governance and budgeting section includes tools to help build capacity within government and community-based organizations, community visioning processes, and examples of participatory budgeting processes, which are more inclusive and community-driven than traditional top-down budgeting processes for neighborhood investments. And then the data metrics and monitoring includes considerations like ensuring that the right quantitative and qualitative data and indicators are being used to inform the need for adaptation strategies, using participatory data collection practices, and ensuring that communities have access to technology that can help them stay engaged with government and decision-making processes. So one case study that I'll highlight illustrating principles that come up in the procedural equity chapters is this Guide to Community-Centered Engagement, which was developed by the Georgetown Climate Center in partnership with the DC Department of Energy and Environment, or DOEE. So as part of a year-long engagement process, GCC and DOEE convened an equity advisory group of community leaders and residents in far northeast neighborhoods of DC's Ward 7 to inform the implementation of the Clean Energy DC and Climate Ready DC plans. These neighborhoods were selected for an intensive community-driven planning process because they were identified in the district's climate vulnerability assessment as facing disproportionate flooding and other climate-related risks relative to other parts of the district. The guide provides lessons from this process and is intended to help district and other local government agencies institutionalize equitable planning processes. In addition to best practices around community engagement, there are specific recommendations for centering racial equity in community engagement. The other, the other broad category of tools in this toolkit encompasses adaptation solutions and equitable outcomes. So implementing policy solutions and programs that seek to more fairly distribute access to the benefits of programs and investments and seek to remedy historic underinvestment in communities. There are currently 7 chapters focused on equitable solutions in different sectors. So the economic resilience chapter includes things like workforce development, hiring practices, and youth engagement, and continuity and economic development planning to support small businesses. The resilient water chapter identifies policy options to help frontline communities deal with flood, drought, and water quality issues. For example, programs that improve access and affordability of clean, safe drinking water. Natural resilience and green space identifies planning, regulatory, government operations, and adaptive reuse practices to enhance access to nature and green space in underinvested urban areas, while seeking to avoid gentrification effects that can occur with these kinds of investments. Resilient energy and utility industry measures includes policies that can enhance access to solar energy, foster grid resilience, and support the development of neighborhood resilience hubs and public purpose microgrids. Affordable housing and anti-displacement includes tools like community benefit agreements and other tenant protections to help prevent displacement, community land trusts that enable community control and stewardship of housing, and other community amenities. Disaster preparedness, response, and recovery includes considerations like equitably engaging communities in relocation efforts following a disaster, supporting the development of resilience hubs, which can provide resources during a disaster, and other tools to help communities during disaster recovery. And then the public health tools identify ways that local governments and public health agencies can support improved health outcomes in frontline communities through their existing authorities and roles, such as planning, disease surveillance and response, and built environment interventions like investing in trees and green space that improve air and water quality. So just for one example, the affordable housing and anti-displacement chapter focuses a section on community land trusts as a valuable tool for preserving permanently affordable and resilient housing while promoting community ownership and decision-making. Community land trusts, or CLTs, are nonprofit organizations with community-led governing structures that hold land in trust for the benefit of the community. They often provide and preserve affordable housing while also stewarding community amenities like parks and green space and providing low-cost commercial properties that can support small businesses and neighborhood economic resilience. So the toolkit draws lessons and case studies from the report shown here, which was developed by Jessica Granis based on in-depth research and interviews with experts and people on the ground working with CLTs in the cities and regions shown on the slide here. The report lays out dual challenges of housing instability and climate change impacts, both of which disproportionately affect lower income communities and communities of color. And it describes how CLTs can help address both of these challenges simultaneously, supporting community empowerment and individual wealth building opportunities, reducing displacement threats, and supporting social cohesion. And then finally, we've also tried to integrate funding and financing solutions throughout the toolkit. So each of the sector specific chapters that I mentioned previously includes its own section on funding to highlight case studies that exemplify different funding or financing approaches to implement equitable investments. But there is also a separate dedicated chapter that covers funding and financing for equitable adaptation. So that focuses on tools like bonds and bank loans, insurance-related financing tools, tax credits, tax increment financing, and land value capture, and other public-private partnership options. And then government, private, and non-governmental entities shown on the slide here are some of the key players that are discussed in that chapter in the context of funding and financing tools for equitable adaptation. And then just one last case study I'll highlight from that section is the Solar for All program in Connecticut. So Connecticut's residential solar incentive program has been around over a decade and successfully promoted residential solar development, but the state recognized after a few years that the program was serving very few low-income homeowners. So to remedy this, the state established a partnership between the Connecticut Green Bank and the solar provider Posigen Solar. So the bank provides financing, which allows Posigen to build solar panels on homes. This allows homeowners to avoid large upfront costs that can be typical for solar installation. And then they on average, reduce their annual energy costs by $450, thanks also in part to efficiency upgrades that Posigen also provides. Posigen owns and leases the panels to homeowners and benefits from the solar rebates that are provided by the state program and from renewable energy credits for excess power created by the panels, which then can be transferred to the Green Bank to make back some of the money that it provided for upfront financing. One last thing I'll just mention on the toolkit is that we are looking to build out a new chapter on resilient and equitable transportation solutions. So that will recognize the role that transportation plays in mitigating climate change, as well as the impact that it can have on the resilience of communities, recognizing also harms of the past related to transportation, especially highway investments, and the need for more meaningful community engagement in early planning stages, and equitable investment and decision-making practices throughout all aspects and all stages of transportation planning and programming. So with that, I will turn it over to Laura or maybe directly to Vic.
Yep. Thank you, Annie. That was a great tour of a very large and complex set of resources that you developed. Vic, I'd like to hand it over to you now.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to set this up. Does that look okay? All right.
Yes.
Great. So hi, everyone. I'm Vic Mohanka. I'm the project manager for the Transformational Climate Finance Initiative with the Chisholm Legacy Project. So we are a brand new environmental justice organization that is organizing on a national scale. We were just founded, I think, last summer, and all of our programs have just begun. Basically, we just started developing it this year. So I'm going to give a little introduction to what I mean by transformational climate finance, and kind of like my program's perspective on policy. And I just want to add some disclaimers here that this isn't our organization's, overall policy framework or anything. This is kind of just how my specific program is starting to develop policy discussions. Let me see. All right. So just as some ground setting, the current financial system is not equitable. So, I included a graph here of the wealth gap for the past 25, 30 years. And as we can see, it's kind of just stayed the same. We're not doing what we need to do as a society to kind of fix that, close these gaps. And I think a big reason for that is on a community level and an individual level, the solutions are not at the scale of the problem. So we've seen a lot of different types of solutions tried, and they don't really go as far as they would need to kind of rectify the inequities. And another thing I want to note, and I think Annie also teed this up, is that the climate crisis is a stressor on the other systems in society. So if we're going to solve it, we have to look at other things like housing and transportation. We can't think of climate as separate from the rest of our economy. And right here, here's a little bit more of expansion of some of this is that the current solutions within our financial framework, they do deliver immediate benefits. So, we do support these policies, but they're not changing the fundamental power dynamics and relationships between people of different classes in society. So some examples that I showed here, job training, which can keep workers in this employment relationship where you're working for somebody else, and you're not actually gaining the wealth generated by your labor. You see a lot of times with economic development and infrastructure investment that a lot of times these projects are set up for very high returns on capital for the developers, the investors, for contractors. And the public benefits, the social benefits, do not accrue at that same rate of return as the people who put up the capital for it. And the third example I gave is social programs, which can generate a lot of profits for service providers. And it creates dependence from communities on the politics and on other bodies to kind of give them what they need. I included a graph here that shows the, in blue, that is the corporate profit share of GDP, and in red, it's the wages share of GDP. And this is for the whole post-war period. And as you can see, wages have gotten a decreasing amount of the share of GDP, partially because the way that our economic system is set up, it shifts the power away from the workers and towards basically the owners, the bosses. So what can we do to fix that? Because that's kind of a really, really big structural problem. I adapted this framework from Mohanka Agbo, and this is a whole field of solidarity economy, how we can build the new and build something that works different and works for everybody. And some of the core concepts are community ownership and community control. Notably, if we go back to the three examples I gave, job training, infrastructure investments, and social programs, those do not build community ownership and community control. So we need something that does more than deliver benefits. We need to actually put the tools in the hands of the people who are suffering the most from the system and the way it works. So some of these solutions would be like cooperatives, member collectives, and actually community land trusts, which Annie also mentioned, are a really great example of a different model that can work for communities. And another thing I wanted to underline here is that communities, one of the goals that we have is self-determination, which requires the economic power to make choices. And it also requires the political power to actually be involved in the decisions that are made. So how can we build policy around some of these principles? So I put these in two different categories. The first one is support for cooperatives. And this is something that I'm working on in Massachusetts as well with Center for Economic Democracy. We have a cooperative worker power coalition, and we're developing a policy agenda and actual advocacy around this. So that looks like technical assistance for new cooperative businesses or conversions, an office of employee ownership with the state government, which can kind of be a hub for a lot of this development. And then creating statutory support within the state laws. A lot of different states have like a patchwork of laws, and having some more, not just consistency, but explicit language about how to set up collectively owned or cooperative businesses would be really helpful. As well as, and that includes, tax benefits and things like that, which often don't really exist for businesses that create significant social benefits. And then the last thing I put down is the right of first offer of refusal. So this is the idea of when somebody sells their business, they offer it to the workers first. And it could also apply to other things like housing and land use and different concepts like that. On the other side, investments. So these are kind of like the what we think of more as like the policy And some of the stuff that we could think about there is adapting the framework of non-extractive finance into public investments. So I sent a link here for people interested in this. I recommend going to seedcommons.org. You can read about it. That is a CDFI that also is a kind of like a loan network of different loan funds around the country that are supporting this kind of work. And they have a really great guide to what non-extractive finance means. And at the end of the day, the basic tenets are, as an investor, you are benefiting the person who receives the investment more than you are getting benefit from it. So that is kind of flipping on the head of the traditional investment structure, where the main goal is to create benefits for the investor without guaranteeing the benefits for the person being invested in. Another thing we could do is invest more in social infrastructure. I like to think of this as like, community centers instead of seawalls. Not everything that is adaptation needs to be like a physical building. There's a lot of social infrastructure that can be built. And I was working with some groups that were trying to map out what this looks like in Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria, and thinking about how to create resilience and microgrids and kind of creating more ability for folks to respond to disasters in like the smaller scale with higher resolution. Another thing is creating accountability and inclusion for frontline and fence line communities. And the last thing I listed here, public and green banks, where, which Annie also mentioned, it's a great way to get more public investments where the private sector doesn't see their own, profits as enough to participate. So, that's basically the presentation. I had a couple, guiding principles for our talk together, but I'm going to pass it on and we can talk as a group. Thank you.
Thanks, Vic. Did you want to drop those discussion questions into the chat? And we could start with those if you like. Or you could just share your slide again.
Yeah, they weren't really questions. They were just some things to keep in mind. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Great. Okay. So I would like to, thank you. I was writing Fast and Furious, and my mind is already thinking, okay, how do we get this out to the folks who need to know? So I want to ask if there are questions first from folks on the call. You can maybe raise your hand, and that will help queue up questions. And Vic, there are a number of accolades coming in over the chat. So.
And Laura, too, I'd invite you to share some of those key takeaways that you might have been writing down, either now or we can put them into the document too.
Thank you. I meant to mention that is something that we invite everybody on the call to do. So please do that so it can help seed our conversation for next month. Thanks, Brianna. So give people a moment to formulate their questions if they have any. Oh, Angie.
Oh, hi, everybody. Thanks for those presentations. It's really applicable for my work right now. I work with a lot of local governments. Part of what I do is work with local governments in California, California Climate and Energy Collaborative. We're working on developing a plenary for a forum on accountable equity. And so this is really good. And so what we're thinking about is so there's a lot of local governments in California trying to do the right thing, beginning to bring people to the table in the right ways, potentially even doing governance that is inclusive of underrepresented voices. But local governments, in my opinion, is where a lot of this really has teeth, right? Like the local planning processes, that's where the regulatory teeth really sits oftentimes for this work. And I'm looking for very specific examples of sort of this next level equity work, which is really being accountable to the outcome. And I'm wondering if you, both the speakers can share examples. I'm seeing lots of approaches to very tangible targeting, so mapping of the people that need to be benefited and served better. And then on the back end, so after you've done the plan, how do we actually how do we evaluate whether or not those people actually benefited, in my opinion, through investment? So have you seen, like, do you have examples or processes in mind that a local government could take and say, all right, that's replicable for me?
That's a really good question. I was just looking back at our data metrics and monitoring tools section, and off the top of my head, I can't think of any that are more like that sort of performance metrics, if you will, or like, but this is something that I feel like has been coming up a lot in conversations recently with like everyone talking about not just adaptation metrics, but like what are the metrics for making sure that, you know, communities are getting what they're asking for and that it's working well. So I don't really have a good answer. I'm going to take another look because I wasn't directly involved in working on those parts of the toolkit, but if I find anything, I will get back to you.
Yeah, I guess say I worked on this issue a bunch in Massachusetts. I worked for the state legislature and with a bunch of the environmental justice coalitions out here. And I also don't have a great answer. So I think one thing that has come to the forefront as I started to develop this new program is I think the way that we think about this and frame these issues of community accountability and participation, it sometimes doesn't take into account the lack of resources that a community has to participate. So that's kind of something that we've struggled a lot with, and I don't know. I think it's a really sticky issue. I think it's kind of one of those things that I don't know how to like resolve it without just saying like economic inequality is kind of like at the core of a lot of this. Because I think at the end of the day, it comes down to asking a community of people who have the least amount of time and resources to participate to kind of, you know, take a risk and participate in a process and in a system that hasn't, you know, benefited them historically, right? Without any sort of guarantee of benefits coming in on the tail, you know, after it's done. So I just wanted to name it's something that like I'm thinking about a lot as well. And I'm like trying to think about how we address it as environmental justice organizers rather than from a government perspective. And even on that front, for organizers, it's been like a long-standing difficulty.
Yeah, I'd be interested in others' thoughts too, but maybe this is something for July. I really, hopefully, you know, from a policy perspective, I think there's a lot of potential there and really thinking through the options for mapping. And there's some really good mapping being done. CBOs might be able to map based on things like former redlining or racial demographics. Governments can't. So governments use these other funky things like environmental burden to map who is in need, or now there's a new one, rural capacity index. So like there's all these different ways to try to figure out who needs help, and there's like restrictions about how you could do it. But I feel like that's the first step, and then you need to figure out, did you help them? Anyway, so that might be a July conversation.
Thanks, Angie. Josh, do you want to elaborate on the question you had put in the chat and you're adding to now?
Yeah, I'm kind of adding to it. I just saw a presentation a few years ago, actually, on a green finance workshop, and there was this concept of public banking and credit unions. It's sort of an amped up credit union concept where instead of looking at local banking as a debt issue, because that's how we kind of look like at our society, we get debt, we loan it out, generate wealth kind of that way. It's looking at banking as wealth generator, particularly for a community and particularly owned by a community. And it just seems like what Vic was talking about, that's kind of like, that's one one logical pathway to sort of like bring two kind of ideas together: climate equity, and wealth generation, and the whole concept of local control of finance. So I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Thanks, Josh. If you don't mind, I think I've got a question I'd like to add in at this time. And I'm curious about the differences between public versus private financing for projects, and particularly, Vic, with the solidarity economy and the idea of restorative economics, and some of the projects that you highlight are some of the opportunities for support. And I guess when I think about the notion of where benefits accrue, and particularly as we think about what are the problems within our existing economic structures that perpetuate inequities. And I guess, are there things that need to be thought of differently when you're talking about addressing kind of the public financing side of things versus the private sector financing kind of things within this framework? I mean, for those of us working in the public sector, for example, are there other aspects of this that are different than when you're talking about this kind of framework with private sector entities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it looks, at least on an advocacy level, it looks completely different for me, because the public doesn't have the same needs or perspective as private financing. So, you're already thinking about what the social public benefits are going to be. You're not just completely beholden to like fiduciary or, the rate of like the, what is it? The like capital acquisition, like making sure that you're keeping your, business attractive for capital. So yeah, I mean, it's completely different. I think, on a public level, I think a lot of the things that we're already talking about are just the things that we have to kind of double down on. So accountability and inclusion and participation. And a lot of times, that could be taken in as like, we'll invite them to our meeting. But I think a different way to think about it might be who is actually at the table that determines what that meeting's agenda is, right? And a lot of times in the public sector, there's a lot of that like top-down hierarchical, your agency director, the legislator, whatever it is, the speaker, the person at the top kind of tells you what you want to be looking for. And I think that kind of whole system that doesn't take into account the people who are benefiting, because of it in the very like decision-making part, that is what leads to this disconnect a lot of times.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Sarissa, do you want to mention what you're posting about?
Sure, thanks so much, Lara. I just wanted to quickly mention the Change Labs effort that's happening, specifically on Navajo and Hopi nations. I'm not directly involved with it, but I have colleagues that have helped launch that. It's a Native American business incubator that's really focused in transitioning historically fossil fuel and resource extraction based economies towards Native business incubator. Native business incubators and supporting Native businesses. So I just wanted to mention it, put a quick note in the chat. Thanks.
Thanks. I want to just maybe quickly note, we haven't, that particularly in the public sector, my experience in doing some of this work in the public sector is just that the timeframes that we've traditionally set up for processes within the public sector do not allow for the time that's required to really effectively engage and partner with community on these issues. And so that has been very frustrating to see where you want to be working with community on an issue, and you're looking at for legal reasons, a regulatory process that has specific checkpoints, and you have to have things done by a certain time. And for community, that pace is not going to work. And so it really, the foundation has to be laid. It takes much longer to lay that foundation and to continue to nurture it and to build on it. So I think part of this is also looking at how do we slow down or at least create some flexibility in processes to allow the kind of engagement and co-development that's needed to come up with more equitable solutions. Stephen, sorry.
Hi, it's Stephen. Thank you. I've been taking a class on intermediate GIS, which is online computer mapping, and I'm an evaluator. And as I'm listening to this discussion, I'm thinking about all of the applications of geostatistics to what we're talking about so that we can make better decisions, because it's not just mapping out where the redlining was going on, but has that resulted in statistically significant differences in outcomes and results for particular neighborhoods, communities, if you will. And with this, you can also do multiple regression analyses and even figure out whether a linear analysis is the best approach. So you could overlay things like income levels in the area and see whether that is a good predictor of whatever you're trying to figure out. So this geostatistics is just started to come to its fore in the GIS community. And I agree with you, Brianna, that the computer mapping is important. And as an evaluator, I'm trying to figure out how to convince evaluators to pay more attention to this. And evaluators always want to contribute to public policy decisions. So I think this is a tool that you should watch for, even if you never learned to do it. Like I am, there are people who are learning to do it, and get those on your teams and involved with your efforts.
Yeah, I will note that I think it's extremely important that our frontline and fence line communities are involved in those mapping, because we've seen from redlining how mapping can really harm communities. And in conversations that I've been involved with communities around climate justice, that mappings can be a two-edged sword or double-edged sword in terms of the harms it can create as well as the opportunities it can create. So it's really important to have, I think, a shared agreement and co-development of what gets mapped and how that information is communicated out to the public.
Well, I agree with that, but the policy decisions that have to be made and the government people doing the policy decisions have to consider more than just community input. So it becomes stronger when you have a statistically significant difference for a community, a particular community. It's not just a political decision, it's a fact-based decision.
All right, thank you. So we're going to close now. I do want to give Vic and Annie maybe just a minute each to close us out with any parting thoughts, and then we'll wrap things up. So maybe starting with Vic, any final closing thoughts for us as we continue these discussions?
Yeah, I guess, thanks for having me. And yeah, I guess I was just trying to set up my presentation to kind of start the process of thinking about these issues in a slightly different way, how we can underscore community ownership and community power. So I think as we, continue on with this work, I would just love to see that, focused on and prioritized by all of our organizations.
Great, thank you. And Annie?
I don't have much. I just wanted to say thank you as well for having me here, and thanks to Vic. I found your presentation super interesting, and I'm looking forward to learning more and hope to join the discussion next month.
Yeah, please do. And we'll be sure to let you know when that gets scheduled. And